Beneath the unforgiving Arizona sun, hatred can burn as fierce as love. For Sarah Winters, men were nothing but broken promises and calloused fists. The frontier had taken everything: her family, her trust, her smile. When she hung the sign at her homestead gate, "No men allowed," the territory laughed. But she meant every word. Then came the day a shadow fell across her porch. Standing there, silent as the desert itself, an Apache with eyes that held neither demand nor pity, just quiet strength. He never spoke of the scars she couldn't hide. She never asked about his. Day by day, small kindnesses where cruelty had been. But when whispers of war threatened to tear apart their fragile peace, will her wounded heart risk trusting one last time? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if the story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Sarah Winters rose before dawn, as she did every morning. The wooden floor was cold beneath her bare feet as she kindled the fire in her small stone hearth. Outside, the Arizona sky was just beginning to lighten, stars fading as the first hint of sunlight touched the distant mountains. She pulled her father's old wool sweater over her nightdress and stepped onto the porch. Her eyes scanned the perimeter of her property, checking the thin wire she'd strung with tin cans around the outer fence, the carefully positioned rocks that would show disturbance if anyone approached in the night. All remained as she had left it. Only then did she allow her shoulders to relax, if only slightly. 3 years. 3 years since she'd claimed this plot of land, built this cabin with her own hands. Well, mostly her own. She'd paid good money to a passing carpenter for the roof. Some things a woman alone couldn't manage, though she'd never admit that in town. Sarah collected eggs from her small henhouse, speaking softly to the chickens. "At least you ladies are reliable." The brown speckled hen clucked in agreement. Animals made more sense than people. They didn't lie, didn't pretend to be something they weren't. Inside, she opened her journal, bound in worn leather that had once been her father's ledger. The pages were filled with her neat, precise handwriting, inventory lists, weather predictions, planting schedules. And sometimes, on the darkest nights when sleep wouldn't come, her memories. October 15th, 1879. "Winter preparations on schedule," she wrote. "Repaired north fence. 6 jars of preserves from last of the garden. Need to replace axe handle before first snow." She never wrote about the nightmares. Some things were better left unwritten. After breakfast, Sarah pulled on her work trousers beneath her skirt. Scandalous by town standards, but practical for a woman who had to be her own man. She tucked a loaded Derringer into her pocket before heading out to mend the chicken coop. The morning passed in the rhythm of work that had become her sanctuary. The repetitive motion of the hammer, the strain in her muscles, the sweat on her brow, all of it kept the memories at bay. It was nearly noon when she sensed rather than heard someone approaching. Sarah's hand moved instantly to her pocket, fingers wrapping around the Derringer as she stepped around the corner of the coop. A boy of about 12 stood nervously at her gate, careful not to touch the weathered wooden sign that read, "No men allowed," in bold, angry letters. "Mrs. Winters?" he called, his voice cracking. "Mr. Henderson sent me. From the mercantile." Sarah didn't correct the Mrs., let them think she was a widow. It was safer that way. "What does Henderson want?" She kept her distance, the Derringer still in her pocket. "Said to tell you your order's in. The seeds and that special tea you wanted." The boy shifted uncomfortably. "Also said if you don't come collect it by Saturday, he'll sell it to someone else." Sarah nodded curtly. "Tell him I'll be in tomorrow." The boy hesitated. "Ma'am? Some riders came through last night, asking questions." Her blood went cold. "What kind of questions?" "About folks who settled here recently. They were asking about a woman traveling alone." He looked down. Mr. Boyd was talking to them plenty. Of course he was. William Boyd had made it his mission to either bed her or drive her out since the day she arrived. A man like him couldn't stomach a woman who didn't need what he offered. "Thank you for telling me." She reached into her pocket, passed the derringer, and pulled out a penny. "For your trouble." The boy's face brightened as he caught the coin she tossed. "Thank you, ma'am." After he'd gone, Sarah stood watching the empty road long after his dust had settled. New riders asking questions never meant anything good. She'd have to be careful in town tomorrow. That night, she checked her traps and warning systems twice. She oiled her father's rifle and loaded the shotgun that hung above her door. The derringer went beneath her pillow, cool metal against her fingertips as she finally closed her eyes. In her dreams, she ran through endless darkness, pursued by faceless men whose footsteps echoed like thunderclaps. She woke with a gasp, the first light of dawn filtering through her window, her hand already clutching the derringer. Another day. Sarah Winters rose and began again, alone in her fortress of solitude, as she had sworn to remain. Hoda Blackhorn. Coda, to the few who earned the right to address him, guided his dun mare along the fence line of the Carson Ranch. The October sun beat down on his broad shoulders as he checked for breaks in the wire, his dark eyes missing nothing. 3 years at this ranch, and still the other hands kept their distance. They called him that Apache when they thought he couldn't hear. It didn't matter. The horses understood him, and Mr. Carson paid fair wages for honest work. A man needed little else. The mare's ears pricked forward suddenly. Coda followed her gaze to the small homestead that bordered Carson's property to the east. A woman worked alone, struggling with a wooden gate that had partially collapsed in yesterday's windstorm. He'd seen her before, always from a distance. The woman who hated men. That's what they called her in town. Their voices either mocking or suspicious. Some said she was touched in the head. Others claimed she'd killed a man back east. Coda paid little attention to white folks' gossip, but he'd noticed how she carried herself, always alert, like prey that knows it's being hunted. The woman abandoned the gate with a gesture of frustration, disappearing into her cabin. Coda continued his patrol, but his eyes returned to the broken gate. Winter was coming. A secure gate mattered. Later that afternoon, as he worked with a spirited black colt in the corral, ranch hand Mike Dolan leaned against the fence, watching. "That woman's at it again," Dolan said, jerking his head toward the neighboring property. "Fixing that gate all wrong. Stubborn as they come." Coda said nothing, focusing on the colt's training. "Carson says she refused to sell when he offered last spring. Said she'd rather die than let a man own her land." Dolan spat tobacco juice into the dust. "Unnatural, if you ask me. Woman like that, all alone." The colt pranced nervously, sensing Coda's tension. He gentled the animal with a soft word in Apache. Heard Boyd still sniffing around her, though she pulled a shotgun on him last time. Dolan chuckled. "Maybe he likes 'em wild." Coda turned his back, effectively ending the conversation. Dolan eventually wandered off, but his words lingered. That evening, as the ranch hands gathered for supper in the bunkhouse, Coda ate quickly and silently as usual. The cook, old Sam, was the only one who ever addressed him directly. "Found this by the south pasture," Sam said, placing a broken metal hinge on the table beside Coda's plate. "Thought you might use it for something. You're good with fixing things." Coda examined the hinge. Heavy iron, well-made despite its broken state. He nodded thanks to Sam and slipped it into his pocket. Long after the others had retired to their bunks, Coda sat outside, working metal with the few tools he owned. The hinge could be mended. It took patience, strength, and knowing how metal wanted to bend. Before dawn, Coda rode out again. The woman's homestead was quiet, no smoke yet rising from the chimney. He approached the broken gate, dismounting silently. The repair took only minutes with the tools he'd brought. The gate swung true now, latching securely. As he remounted, movement caught his eye, a curtain falling back into place at the cabin window. He didn't linger. 3 days later, Coda rode past the woman's property again. The gate remained in place, But now a new length of barbed wire had been strung along the top, an added deterrent. A clear message. Repairs accepted, but boundaries remained. He understood boundaries, respected them. The following week, as Coda led a string of horses to fresh pasture, he saw her clearly for the first time. She stood at her well, drawing water, a rifle slung across her back. Their eyes met briefly across the distance. She didn't wave or nod, but she didn't reach for her rifle either. It was acknowledgement enough. In town that Saturday, Coda noticed her at the mercantile, arguing with Henderson about the price of seed. Her voice was lower than he'd expected, steady and determined. When she turned to leave, her eyes widened slightly at the sight of him. For a moment something passed between them, recognition perhaps, two outsiders in a world that had no place for either. Then William Boyd entered the store, and Coda watched her body language transform instantly. Shoulders tensing, hand moving subtly toward her pocket. Fear and hatred carefully controlled. Coda left without purchasing the tobacco he'd come for. Some places weren't meant for him, and some battles weren't his to fight. But the next morning, when he found one of Carson's calves tangled in the barbed wire near her property, he fixed the fence again. This time, he left no trace of his presence except a job well done. Sarah pulled her father's pocket watch from her apron, its familiar weight comforting in her palm. The ritual never varied. Check the time before heading to town, verify the shotgun was loaded, count her meager coins twice. But today, the watch's hands remained stubbornly fixed at 10:17. She frowned, shaking it gently. Nothing. She held it to her ear. Silence where there should have been a steady tick. No, she whispered. The watch was more than a timepiece. It was her last connection to her father. The only item she'd managed to keep through everything. Sarah placed it carefully on the table. She could survive without knowing the exact time. But the thought of the watch remaining lifeless, its mechanical heart stilled, caused an ache in her chest she couldn't ignore. The watchmaker was in town, which meant she'd have to make an extra trip this month, which meant more exposure, more risk. The journey to Copper Springs took 30 minutes on foot. Sarah wore her most modest dress, hair tightly pinned beneath her bonnet, shotgun hidden beneath a shawl despite the warm day. Her hand drifted to her pocket repeatedly, feeling for the familiar outline of the derringer. The town had grown since she'd first arrived in the territory. New storefronts lined the main street, including Henderson's expanded mercantile. Progress, they called it. Sarah saw only more people, more eyes, more danger. She entered the watchmaker's shop, a small bell announcing her arrival. The elderly proprietor, Mr. Finch, looked up from his workbench with magnifying glasses perched on his nose, making his eyes appear owlish. "Mrs. Winters," he said, removing the glasses. "Rare to see you twice in a month." Sarah placed the pocket watch on the counter between them. It stopped. Finch examined it without touching. "Your father's." She nodded once, surprised he remembered. She'd mentioned it only once years ago. "May I?" he asked, hands hovering. Another nod. Sarah watched tensely as his wrinkled fingers opened the case with practiced ease. "Ah," he said after a moment. "Nothing serious. Needs cleaning and oiling. Haven't serviced it in some time. Have you? Can you fix it?" "Of course." He peered at her over his spectacles. "Take 2 days. Cost you 50 cents. She'd expected more. "That's fair. Come Friday afternoon. Should be ready." Sarah nodded, suddenly eager to leave. 2 more days without the watch. 2 more trips to town. But necessary. The mercantile was busier than usual when she entered. Women gathered near the fabric section whispered as she passed. Sarah kept her eyes forward, list clutched tightly in hand. "Miss Winters," Henderson greeted her with professional courtesy. At least he didn't use the false Mrs. that others insisted upon. "Your order's ready." As he gathered her items, the bell above the door jingled. The shop fell momentarily silent, then resumed its buzz of conversation. Sarah didn't need to turn to know who had entered. The prickling sensation between her shoulder blades told her enough. "Well, if it isn't the lovely Miss Winters," came the booming voice of William Boyd. "Twice blessed to encounter such beauty in 1 week." Sarah kept her gaze on Henderson, who had suddenly become very interested in counting out coffee beans. Boyd moved closer, his expensive cologne invading her space before he did. "I've just acquired 200 additional acres adjoining your property. Makes me your neighbor on 3 sides now." "My bill, Mr. Henderson," Sarah said firmly, ignoring Boyd. "You're surrounded, Miss Winters," Boyd continued, his voice dropping. "Might be time to reconsider my offer. Land's no place for a woman alone." The mercantile had gone quiet again, the other customers pretending not to listen while hanging on every word. Sarah placed exact payment on the counter, gathered her purchases, and turned to leave. Boyd stepped into her path. "I'm a patient man," he said softly, so only she could hear. "But patience has limits." She met his eyes then, letting him see what she usually kept hidden: the cold hatred, the absolute resolve. "So do I, Mr. Boyd. Please move." Something in her expression made him step aside, though his smile never faltered. "Think about what I said. Winter's coming. Harsh season for someone with no friends." Outside, Sarah exhaled shakily, clutching her packages. The trip to retrieve her watch now seemed more dangerous than before. Boyd rarely made threats without follow-through. As she started down the boardwalk, she glimpsed a familiar figure across the street. The Apache from the Carson Ranch, loading supplies into a wagon. Their eyes met briefly before she looked away. She felt his gaze follow her all the way to the edge of town. But unlike Boyd's attention, it didn't make her skin crawl. Instead, it felt almost like protection. Sarah shook off the thought. She protected herself. No one else could be trusted with that responsibility. At home, she checked her warning systems twice, then cleaned her shotgun with meticulous care. 2 more days until she could reclaim her father's watch. 2 more days to prepare for whatever Boyd might be planning. Friday arrived with ominous clouds gathering on the horizon. Sarah set out for town earlier than planned, hoping to return before the storm broke. The weight of the absent pocket watch felt like a phantom limb. The streets of Copper Springs bustled with unusual activity. A supply wagon had arrived from Tucson, drawing folks from outlying homesteads. Sarah kept her head down, moving purposefully toward Finch's shop. The watchmaker greeted her with a pleased smile. "Perfect timing, Miss Winters. Just finished this morning." He presented her father's watch, its silver case gleaming, the hands moving with precise, steady clicks. Sarah held it to her ear, closing her eyes briefly at the familiar rhythm. "Sounds right," she said, digging in her pocket for the coins. "Cleaned every gear," Finch said proudly. "Should run true for years now, long as you wind it regular." She nodded, securing the watch in her pocket. "Thank you. If I may." Finch hesitated, lowering his voice. "Might want to avoid the mercantile today. Boyd's in there, celebrating his new land purchase. Been drinking since noon." Sarah stiffened. "I need supplies. Just a friendly warning." Finch shrugged. "Man's been talking big about his plans for the territory. Your name's come up." She should have turned around then, gone straight home. But winter was approaching, and she needed everything on her list. Sarah squared her shoulders and headed for Henderson's store. She smelled the whiskey before she saw him. Boyd stood at the counter, surrounded by 3 ranch hands, his loyal shadows. A silver dollar spun on the wooden surface as Henderson tallied their purchases. "Double it, Henderson," Boyd slurred. "My men worked hard this week." He slapped another silver dollar beside the first. "That land's mine now, fair and square." Sarah sidled along the far wall, selecting items quickly. Sugar, coffee, lamp oil, ammunition. The the basic necessities. Well, look who it is. Boyd's voice boomed across the store. The Ice Queen herself. The other customers scattered like startled birds, finding sudden interest in distant shelves. Henderson's face remained carefully neutral as Sarah approached the counter, placing her items down. Restocking the fortress? Boyd moved closer, whiskey fumes enveloping her. Won't do you much good. That parcel I bought includes your water rights. Sarah kept her eyes on Henderson. My bill, please. You hear what I said? Boyd's hand came down hard beside her purchases. Without water access, that land's worthless. My deed includes water rights to the creek, Sarah replied evenly, finally looking at him. As recorded with the territorial office. Boyd's smile turned ugly. Papers get lost. Records burn. Terrible accidents happen all the time out here. Henderson cleared his throat. That'll be $1.15, Miss Winters. She counted out the coins, aware of Boyd moving closer, deliberately invading her space. Mr. Henderson, she said, would you package these while I select a few more items? The storekeeper nodded, relief evident in his eyes at the temporary reprieve from the building tension. Sarah turned, only to find Boyd blocking her path. His arm shot out, gripping her wrist with surprising strength for a man so drunk. You think you're better than everyone, he hissed. Too good for a man's protection. Too proud to admit you need help. His fingers tightened. Pride's a sin, Miss Winters. She didn't struggle or show fear. Both would only feed his satisfaction. Remove your hand, Mr. Boyd. Or what? He leaned closer. You'll shoot me? In front of witnesses? They'll hang you by sunset. A sudden shadow fell across them both. Neither had noticed the door opening, the silent figure entering. Coda stood there, tall and still as a mountain pine. He said nothing, made no threatening move. He simply existed, his presence inserting itself between Sarah and Boyd like an immovable object. Boyd's face darkened. This ain't your business, Indian. Coda didn't respond, didn't even blink. His eyes, black as obsidian, remained fixed on Boyd with unwavering intensity. The silence stretched, uncomfortable and electric. Even Boyd's ranch hands shifted nervously. Finally, Boyd released Sarah's wrist with a disgusted sound. Keep your red dog on a leash, Miss Winters. Might be rabid. He tossed a silver dollar onto the counter. Put their purchases on my tab, Henderson. My charity to the unfortunate. With that, he shouldered past Coda, deliberately bumping him hard. His men followed, casting wary glances at the Apache. When they'd gone, the store seemed to collectively exhale. Henderson quickly packaged Sarah's purchases, adding an extra tin of coffee with a nervous nod. Not once during the entire encounter had Coda spoken a single word. Now he simply stepped aside, clearing Sarah's path to the door. She hesitated, the moment stretching between them. I didn't need rescuing, she finally said, her voice low. Coda inclined his head slightly. I know. His voice was deep with the barest hint of an accent. 2 words, the first she'd ever heard him speak. Outside, the storm clouds had gathered in earnest, the first heavy drops beginning to fall. Without another word, they walked into the rain, each in their own direction. The first frost came early that year, silvering the ground overnight in mid-October. Sarah woke to find her water bucket iced over and the chicken's trough frozen solid. She broke the ice with a hammer, watching her. Breath cloud in the morning air. Inside, she consulted her dog-eared almanac, its pages worn thin from years of handling. Her father had taught her to trust its predictions, and this year it foretold a bitter winter. She ran her finger down the columns of neat print, mentally calculating her supplies. Enough flour, coffee, and beans. Preserves from summer's garden lined her shelves in colorful rows. Ammunition was sufficient, but firewood, she frowned at her estimate. Not enough. Not nearly enough if the almanac was right. Sarah pulled on her heaviest coat and spent the morning stacking what wood she had beneath the lean-to beside her cabin. The work aggravated her old shoulder injury, a souvenir from a time she refused to remember. By midday, the pain had become a dull throb that extended down her arm. She stopped, leaning on her axe, and surveyed the pitiful stack. Perhaps 3 weeks' worth if she was frugal. The surrounding land had been picked clean of deadfall over her 3 years of residence. She would need to venture farther out into less familiar territory. For a moment, she considered asking Henderson to arrange a delivery from the lumber mill. But that would mean owing someone, depending on someone, trusting someone. Unacceptable risks. The next morning, Sarah set out before dawn, wagon hitched to her elderly mule, axe and saw secured in the back. She headed north, following the creek that marked her property line, up into the foothills where pine and oak grew thicker. The day was long and grueling. Each swing of the axe sent shards of pain through her shoulder. Each log loaded onto the wagon took more effort than the last. By late afternoon, she had managed to fill only half the wagon bed. As she paused to rest, the crack of a branch breaking nearby sent her hand to the rifle propped against a tree trunk. She waited, motionless, every sense alert. A deer stepped delicately into view, raising its head to stare at her with liquid eyes before bounding away. Sarah exhaled slowly, her heart still racing. Not Boyd, not his men, just wildlife. But the sun was lowering, and she'd ventured farther than planned. She would need to leave now to reach home before dark. Half a wagon was better than none. The journey back was slower, the loaded wagon straining her mule's strength on the downward slopes. Dusk had fallen by the time her cabin came into view, its windows dark and uninviting. Sarah felt the familiar weight of solitude settle on her shoulders as she unhitched the mule. Too exhausted to unload the wood, she left it in the wagon and trudged inside, lighting a lamp with stiff fingers. Her shoulder had progressed from throbbing to stabbing pain. She heated water for a compress, knowing she'd pay for today's work with a week of discomfort. For 3 days, Sarah split and stacked the logs she'd gathered, pushing through the pain. On the 4th morning, she hitched up the wagon again, resigned to another backbreaking day in the foothills. But as she rounded the corner of her cabin, she stopped short. There, neatly stacked beside her lean-to, was a pile of firewood nearly as tall as she was. Oak, pine, and cedar, all cut to perfect stove length. Sarah approached it cautiously, as though it might be a mirage. The wood was real enough, more than enough to see her through the first half of winter. On top of the pile lay a single eagle feather. She picked it up, running her fingers along its length. Not a gift. Payment, perhaps, for the gate repair. A trade between equals. That night, Sarah built a fire with the mysterious wood. It burned clean and hot, warming her cabin more effectively than her own meager supply ever had. Outside, the temperature continued to drop, and the first snowflakes began to fall. She took out her journal, hesitating over the blank page. Finally, she wrote, October 30th, 1879. First snow. Mysterious delivery of firewood. Suspect Carson ranch hand. The Apache. Unknown motives. Remain vigilant. She paused, then added, Eagle feather kept for inspection. In truth, she had placed the feather on the mantel above her fireplace, its dark lines gleaming in the lamplight. Just to study it, she told herself, to understand what it might signify. As she prepared for bed, Sarah caught herself checking the window more frequently than usual. Not for threats, but for a glimpse of a tall figure moving through the darkness. She shook her head at her own foolishness. One act of kindness didn't erase a lifetime of hard lessons. Men wanted things. Always. The Apache would reveal his price eventually. Still, as she drifted towards sleep, the cabin warmer than it had been in days, Sarah found herself planning. Tomorrow she would bake extra bread. Good, hearty loaves with the last of her dried berries worked into the dough. just to restore balance. Nothing more. November turned bitter with a vengeance that surprised even the oldest settlers. Snow fell in thick blankets, piling against Sarah's cabin walls and drifting across her yard until the chicken coop was nearly buried. The creek froze solid. Paths had to be shoveled daily just to reach the woodpile and well. Sarah had left fresh bread on her fence post the morning after discovering the firewood. By evening, the loaves were gone. Neither she nor the Apache acknowledged the exchange, but twice more she left food. Once a jar of preserves, once a rabbit stew, and twice the offerings disappeared. Then the blizzard hit. 3 days of howling wind and stinging ice that made stepping outside impossible. Sarah huddled by her fire, feeding it carefully measured logs, rationing her supplies as the storm raged. On the 4th morning, the wind finally died. She woke to an eerie silence and a cabin grown cold overnight. Her head pounded as she rose, her limbs unusually heavy. By noon, she couldn't deny it any longer. She was ill. Fever burned through her, leaving her alternately shivering and sweating. Each breath became a struggle as her chest tightened. Sarah had nursed her parents through fever. She knew the progression, the danger. Alone, with no one to bring water or medicine, many didn't survive. She forced herself to add wood to the dying fire, then collapsed back onto her bed. The ceiling spun above her as delirium set in. In her fever dreams, her father sat beside her bed, his pocket watch ticking in his palm. Her mother folded laundry by the window, humming softly, and darker shapes lurked at the edges. Men with cruel eyes and grasping hands. Time lost meaning. Day blended into night and back again. Once, she thought she heard her door open, felt cold air rush in. A dark figure moved about her cabin. Death perhaps come to collect her. Sarah was too weak to reach for her derringer. But death brought water to her cracked lips. Death built up her fire and placed cool cloths on her forehead. Death smelled of pine and horses and would smoke. When lucidity returned, Sarah found a cup of water beside her bed. The fire burned steadily. Her fever had broken, leaving her weak but clear-headed. And on her table sat a small clay pot of strong-smelling salve. More surprising were the other changes. Her chickens had been fed. Fresh water filled her bucket. Somehow, in her days of illness, her small homestead had continued to function without her. Sarah dipped a finger in the salve, sniffing it cautiously. Unfamiliar herbs, but the scent was clean, medicinal. She applied it to her chest as directed by the crude pictograph drawn on a scrap of paper, a simple figure with hands at its chest. The effect was immediate. Her breathing eased as the pungent aroma cleared her congested lungs. Days passed as she regained her strength. Each morning revealed new evidence of her mysterious caretaker. Fresh water, fed animals, maintained fire. Yet she never caught sight of him, though she tried staying awake through the night. He came like a shadow and left no tracks in the new-fallen snow. As her health returned, so did her independence. Sarah began reclaiming her chores, leaving notes by the door, chickens fed or have enough water, to prevent duplicated efforts. It felt strange, this silent cooperation with an unseen presence. One evening, as twilight settled over the snow-covered landscape, Sarah sat by her fire sewing. The rabbit skins had been her project for weeks, carefully tanned, cut, and now being assembled into gloves. Men's gloves with longer fingers than her own would require. She told herself it was merely practical, a fair exchange for the salve that had saved her life. Nothing more. The gloves took shape under her skilled hands, functional but finely crafted, lined with soft wool she'd unraveled from an old shawl. She worked a simple design into the cuffs, nothing fancy, just a row of neat stitches forming a geometric pattern. When completed, she wrapped them in a clean cloth and placed them on the fence post. The next morning they were gone. In their place lay a small carved wooden horse, no bigger than her palm, exquisitely detailed down to its flowing mane. Sarah held it in her hand, turning it over in the morning light. No one had given her a gift. Not a real gift with no expectations attached since her parents died. She placed the carving on her mantle beside the eagle feather. That night, she wrote in her journal, December 15th, 1879. Health restored. Debts repaid. Then, after a long pause, she added, His name is Coda. The other ranch hands call him this. Information, she told herself. Just information about a neighbor. Nothing more. Yet she found herself tracing the letters of his name with her fingertip before closing the journal. The grip of winter began to loosen in early March. Snow receded from the south-facing slopes, revealing patches of muddy earth beneath. The creek ice thinned, water gurgling beneath its crystalline surface. In the morning, Sarah heard the tentative songs of returning birds. She stepped onto her porch, inhaling deeply. The air carried the scent of possibility. Her body felt stronger than it had before the illness, her mind clearer. She had survived another winter alone. Though not entirely alone, a small voice reminded her. The carved horse watched her from the mantel each evening. She hadn't returned to town since before the snow, relying on her stored supplies. Now those supplies were dwindling, but the prospect of the journey didn't fill her with the usual dread. Sarah consulted her almanac, planning her spring planting. This year she would expand her garden, try new vegetables. Perhaps even flowers, impractical but suddenly desirable. Her gaze drifted to the hills where the Carson Ranch sprawled. No sign of riders today. The knock at her door came late afternoon as she mended a torn shirt. Sarah froze, needle poised mid-stitch. No one knocked on her door. Not in 3 years. She reached for the shotgun, approaching cautiously. Who's there? No answer. Heart pounding. She cracked the door open, shotgun ready. Nobody stood on her porch. Instead, a small deerskin pouch lay at her feet. Sarah scanned the surroundings before retrieving it, closing and bolting the door quickly. Inside the pouch, she found seeds. Dozens of different kinds, some familiar, others strange to her. A scrap of paper bore crude drawings. Plants with flowers, some tall, some low to the ground. Their blooms depicted in different shapes. Wildflowers. Seeds for plants that served no purpose except beauty. Sarah stood motionless, the pouch cradled in her palms. The unexpected thoughtfulness of the gift made her throat tighten. Practical supplies she could justify as neighborly duty, but this was something else entirely. The next morning, she began preparing a new bed along the south side of her cabin where the flowers would get the most sun. As she worked the soil, a movement near the chicken coop caught her eye. Her prized Rhode Island red had escaped again, making a break for freedom across the yard. Sarah dropped her trowel and gave chase, but the chicken was surprisingly swift, darting under the fence toward the open meadow. "Stop, you stupid bird!" Sarah called, ducking through the fence rails. The chicken paused, cocking its head as if considering the request, then continued its escape with renewed determination. Sarah hadn't crossed her property line in months. As she pursued the wayward hen into the meadow, she felt strangely exposed, vulnerable in the open space. She didn't notice the approaching rider until his shadow fell across her path. Looking up, she found herself standing directly before Coda, mounted on his dun mare. For a moment, they simply stared at one another, the chickens forgotten. In daylight, she could see his features clearly. The strong line of his jaw, the small scar above his left eyebrow, the depth of his dark eyes. He wore the rabbit fur gloves she had made. "Your chicken," he said finally, gesturing to where the Rhode Island red was now contentedly pecking at fresh spring shoots. Sarah straightened, suddenly conscious of her muddy hands and disheveled hair. "She escapes. Regularly." The corner of Coda's mouth twitched, not quite a smile. He dismounted in one fluid motion and approached the chicken with slow, deliberate steps. To Sarah's amazement, he made a soft clicking sound, and the troublesome hen tilted her head, then actually walked toward him. He scooped her up with gentle hands. "She's a good bird," he said, transferring the now docile chicken to Sarah's arms. "Brave." Their fingers brushed during the exchange, sending an unexpected warmth up Sarah's arm. She stepped back quickly. "Thank you," she said stiffly. Then, after a pause, "For the seeds as well." Coda nodded once. "Good soil here. Will grow strong." "I've never grown flowers before," Sarah admitted. "Seems impractical." "Beauty is necessary," he replied simply. "Like water, like air." The words hung between them, unexpectedly profound. An awkward silence followed, neither sure how to continue this first real conversation. Sarah clutched her chicken like a shield. "Would you?" The words surprised her even as she spoke them. "There's coffee, if you want some." Coda studied her face, as if searching for something hidden there. Whatever he saw must have satisfied him, because he nodded once. Coffee would be good. Sarah turned toward her cabin, heart pounding for reasons she couldn't name. Behind her, Coda led his horse, his footsteps nearly silent on the spring earth. The chicken, traitor that she was, settled contentedly in Sarah's arms, apparently satisfied with the day's adventure. At the porch, Sarah hesitated, looking at the weathered men allowed sign still nailed beside her door. Coda followed her gaze but said nothing, his expression unreadable. Making a decision, Sarah pushed the door open and stepped inside. "It's not very good coffee," she warned. "That's all right," Coda replied, tying his horse to the porch rail. "I'm not a very good guest." It might have been her imagination, but Sarah thought she saw the hint of a smile as he followed her into the cabin. The first man to cross her threshold in 3 years. Sarah's hands trembled slightly as she stoked the fire and hung the coffee pot over the flames. Coda stood just inside the door, his presence filling her small cabin in a way she hadn't anticipated. He removed his hat but kept his eyes downcast, giving her space even within the confined quarters. "Sit," she said, gesturing to the table. "If you want." He settled onto the bench, his movements deliberate and quiet. Sarah busied herself with cups and the last of her sugar, hyper-aware of this intrusion into her solitude. Yet it didn't feel threatening, uncomfortable, yes, but not dangerous. "Carson doesn't mind you being here?" she asked, needing to break the silence. "Day off," Coda replied. "Work horses all week. Rest on Sunday." The coffee began to bubble. Sarah poured 2 cups, setting one before him. She remained standing, leaning against her counter, maintaining distance. Coda wrapped his hands around the cup but didn't drink immediately. "Thank you. For the gloves. Good work." Sarah nodded, uncertain how to respond to the compliment. "The medicine you left. It helped. My grandmother's recipe. For chest sickness." "Your grandmother was a healer?" A shadow passed over his face. "Was. Long ago." Sarah recognized the pain in his voice, the same note that entered her own when speaking of family. Loss recognized loss. "You were a scout," she said, remembering town gossip. "For the army." He nodded once. 5 years. Tracked Apache raiders across 3 territories. "Your own people?" "Not my people," he corrected. "Different band. Enemies of my family for generations." "But the army, they treated you well?" She couldn't keep the skepticism from her voice. Coda looked directly at her then, his dark eyes holding a lifetime of hard truths. "Used me, then tried to put me on reservation when fighting ended. Like a tool returned to shed." He sipped his coffee, then added, "Left before they could. And came here." Sarah found herself wondering about the journey between, what had brought him to this particular corner of the territory, to Carson's ranch, to her fence line. "Land speaks to me here," he said simply. "Feels right." Sarah understood that feeling, though she'd never articulated it. This patch of earth had called to her too, had felt like somewhere she could root herself after years of drifting. They lapsed into silence, but it felt less strained now. Through the window, Sarah could see the afternoon light beginning to soften toward evening. Soon it would be dark. Soon she would be alone again. The thought didn't bring its usual comfort. "Your flowers," Coda said suddenly. "Plant after last frost. 2 weeks more, maybe." "I've never grown anything but vegetables," Sarah admitted. "Don't know if I can keep flowers alive. They want to live, just need chance." He looked around her cabin, taking in her neat shelves, the carefully maintained stove, the mended curtains. "You have good hands for growing things." The unexpected praise made her flush. To hide her reaction, Sarah moved to the door, opening it in clear indication that the visit was concluded. "I should tend to the chickens before dark." Coda rose, settling his hat back on his head. At the threshold, he paused. "The red one will escape again. Curious spirit. Like all females who don't know what's good for them," Sarah said dryly. To her surprise, Coda laughed. A rich, warm sound that transformed his solemn face. "No, like those who know exactly what they want." With that, he stepped outside, untied his horse, and mounted. Sarah watched him ride toward the Carson property, his straight back silhouetted against the darkening sky. The next day, Sarah found herself working in the new flower bed, carefully marking rows with string and small stakes. She told herself it was merely to pass time, to have something besides vegetables to tend. It had nothing to do with the conversation of the previous day. The sound of approaching hoofbeats made her look up. Her hand instinctively moved toward the derringer in her pocket, but relaxed when she recognized Coda's dun mare. He dismounted, leading the horse to the fence. "Fence needs mending," he said by way of greeting, pointing to a sagging section. "Brought tools." Sarah straightened, brushing dirt from her hands. "I can fix my own fence." "No, you can," he replied evenly. "Also know about your shoulder. Old injury. Hurts when weather changes." She stiffened. "Been watching me that closely?" "Been watching," he acknowledged without apology. "Same as you watch when I ride past." The directness caught her off guard. She had watched him, had found her eyes drawn to his figure whenever he worked Carson's south pasture. She told herself it was prudence. Keeping track of nearby men was simple survival. But Coda's steady gaze suggested he saw more than she intended to reveal. "Fine," she said finally. "You can fix the fence. I'll make lunch." It wasn't friendship, not exactly. But as they worked separately through the afternoon, Coda at the fence line, Sarah in her garden and kitchen, she found an unexpected peace in the companionable silence, broken only by the rhythm of his hammer and the spring birds overhead. Spring brought renewed activity to Copper Springs. A monthly market day had been established, drawing farmers and craftspeople from outlying areas to trade their goods. Sarah had avoided these gatherings, preferring to conduct her business quietly at Henderson's store. But her supplies were critically low after the harsh winter, and the market offered better prices than she could get elsewhere. "I'm going to town tomorrow," she told Coda during one of his now regular visits to her homestead. Over the past few weeks, he'd helped repair her roof, reinforced her chicken coop, and spent hours working alongside her in comfortable silence. He looked up from the bridle he was mending. "Market day." "Yes." She hesitated. "I could bring back anything you need." "Will go myself," he said. "Carson needs grain. New axe handles." Sarah nodded, ignoring the strange relief she felt knowing he would be in town too. It wasn't that she needed his protection. She'd managed alone for years. Still, Boyd had been unusually persistent lately, riding past her property, leaving unwanted gifts on her fence post. The next morning dawned clear and mild. Sarah dressed with unusual care, selecting her least worn dress and pinning her hair neatly beneath her bonnet. She tucked the derringer into her pocket out of habit, then hesitated before adding her father's pocket watch to her other pocket. Its familiar weight was comforting. The 2-mile walk to town passed quickly. As she approached Copper Springs, she could hear the bustle of market day. Wagon wheels on packed dirt, livestock bleating, children laughing. The town's main street had been transformed into rows of stalls selling everything from fresh produce to handcrafted furniture. Sarah moved through the crowd with purpose, filling her basket with necessities. Needles, salt, dried herbs she couldn't grow herself. People glanced at her but mostly kept their distance, her reputation as a recluse working in her favor. She was examining a bolt of sturdy cotton when she sensed a presence nearby. Looking up, she saw Coda across the street, loading sacks of grain into a Carson ranch wagon. Their eyes met briefly before she returned her attention to the fabric. "That would make a fine dress," said the seamstress hopefully. "Bring out the color in your cheeks." "Just need enough for patches," Sarah replied, measuring out a modest length. As she paid, the atmosphere around her subtly shifted. Conversations quieted. People stepped aside. Sarah knew without looking that William Boyd had arrived. He appeared beside her, dressed in his Sunday best, smelling of cologne and whiskey despite the early hour. "Miss Winters, a pleasure to see you in town." Sarah nodded curtly, gathering her purchases. "Mr. Boyd, you've been keeping company with Carson's Indian," he said, his voice carrying deliberately. "Folks are talking." "Folks always talk," she replied, attempting to step around him. "Doesn't make it their business." Boyd moved to block her path. When a white woman takes up with a savage, it becomes everyone's business. His smile remained fixed, but his eyes had hardened. "Reflects poorly on all of us. On the town's reputation." Sarah felt heat rising to her face. "I haven't taken up with anyone, and what I do on my own property isn't your concern. Everything in this valley is my concern." Boyd stepped closer, lowering his voice. "I've been patient, Sarah, respected your peculiarities. But my patience has limits. So does my tolerance for harassment," she snapped, louder than intended. Nearby conversations stopped entirely, heads turning toward them. Boyd's expression darkened. He gripped her arm suddenly, fingers digging into her flesh. "You do well to remember your position here. A woman alone has no standing." Sarah tried to pull away, but his grip tightened painfully. "Let go of me. Not until you agree to hear my proposition. Properly over dinner. I believe the lady asked you to release her." The new voice, Sheriff Taylor, cut through the tension. The lawman approached slowly, thumbs hooked in his belt. "Everything all right here, Miss Winters?" Before she could answer, Boyd interjected smoothly. "Just a misunderstanding, Sheriff. Miss Winters and I were discussing business matters." "Didn't look like business to me," came another voice. Coda stood nearby, his face impassive but his body tense as a drawn bow. Boyd's face contorted with disgust. "Keep your red dog muzzled, Sheriff, or I won't be responsible for what happens." "That's enough, Boyd," Taylor warned, though his tone lacked conviction. Everyone knew where the sheriff's loyalties ultimately lay, with the valley's largest landowner and biggest taxpayer. "The Indian has no place here," Boyd continued, releasing Sarah's arm but stepping toward Coda. "Markets for civilized folk." Town council agreed. Several of Boyd's ranch hands materialized from the crowd, forming a loose circle. The sheriff glanced between them uneasily, then at the growing audience. "No law against him being here," Taylor said reluctantly. "Long as he's peaceful." "He works for Carson," Sarah said, finding her voice. "He's here on legitimate business." Boyd turned to her, genuine surprise on his face. "You're defending him? After what his kind did to settlers? To women like you?" "He has a name," Sarah replied steadily. "Codahoda Blackhorn. He's done nothing but help me when others wouldn't." A murmur rippled through the onlookers. Sarah became acutely aware that her dress sleeve had torn where Boyd gripped her, exposing her shoulder and a glimpse of the old scar tissue beneath. Boyd's expression shifted from surprise to calculation. "I see how it is." The Virgin's found herself a pet savage. He spat on the ground near Coda's feet. "Disgrace to your race, Miss Winters." Coda remained motionless, though Sarah could see the tension in his jaw. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet but carried clearly. "This man dishonors himself. Not worth your words." The simple dignity of his statement hung in the air, making Boyd's crudeness all the more apparent by contrast. The sheriff cleared his throat awkwardly. "Market's getting crowded. Think you both should conclude your business and head home." Boyd glared at Coda a moment longer before turning away with a disgusted sound. "This isn't finished." As Boyd and his men pushed through the crowd, Sarah realized she was trembling. Not with fear, but with rage. The torn sleeve, the public scene, the ugly implications, all of it designed to humiliate and control. Coda approached cautiously, respecting her space even now. "Ready to leave?" Sarah nodded, suddenly desperate to escape the staring eyes and whispered comments. Side by side, they walked away from the market, neither speaking until they'd reached the edge of town. The walk from town stretched in silence between them. Sarah clutched her torn sleeve closed, humiliation burning her cheeks. Coda led his loaded wagon beside her, matching his horse's pace to her steps. "You shouldn't have defended me," he finally said as they crested the hill that marked the halfway point to her homestead. Sarah kept her eyes on the dusty road. "You shouldn't have intervened. Boyd is dangerous. I know exactly how dangerous men like Boyd can be." The bitterness in her voice silenced him again. They continued until they reached the fork where the path split, one branch leading to her property, the other to Carson's ranch. Sarah stopped, finally looking at him directly. "Thank you," she said stiffly, "for being there. But I can handle Boyd." Coda studied her face. "Not questioning your strength. Then what are you questioning? Why fight alone when you don't have to?" The simple question struck her like a physical blow. Sarah had been alone so long that solitude had become both her armor and her prison. The idea that she might have a choice in the matter was unsettling. "Come for supper," she said suddenly. "Tomorrow, if you want." Surprise flickered across his features before he nodded once. "We'll bring venison, fresh killed." They parted ways, Sarah's mind churning with the day's events. At home, she changed out of her torn dress, examining the fabric with a sigh. Mending the sleeve would be possible, but the dress would never look the same. Another small damage inflicted by William Boyd. As she moved around her cabin, Sarah found herself straightening things that didn't need straightening, sweeping a floor that was already clean, preparing, though she wouldn't admit it, for tomorrow's guest. In her trunk, beneath carefully folded linens, lay her mother's recipe book, a small, leather-bound volume filled with elegant handwriting. Sarah hadn't opened it in years. The memories were too painful, too closely entwined with everything she'd lost. Now she sat on her bed, the book heavy in her lap. Slowly, she turned the pages, recipes for biscuits and stews appearing alongside her mother's notes about which dishes her father favored, which had been Sarah's childhood preferences. One page bore a recipe for venison pie with wild mushrooms and herbs, John's favorite for special occasions. Her mother had written in the margin, "Makes him smile every time." Sarah traced the handwriting with her fingertip. Tomorrow she would make this pie. The next evening, she worked nervously in her kitchen, rolling out dough with more care than usual. The venison Coda had left on her porch that morning had been expertly butchered, tender and fresh. She'd gathered wild onions and the season's first young herbs to complete the dish. The knock came precisely at sunset. Sarah smoothed her hair, loose today instead of severely pinned, and opened the door. Coda stood on her porch, clean-shaven, hair tied back neatly. He'd brought something wrapped in a cloth. Wildflowers, she realized as he handed them to her. "From the seeds," he explained. First blooms. Sarah accepted them awkwardly and used to such gestures. Thank you. They're beautiful. Inside, she placed the flowers in a jar of water while Coda settled at her table. The small cabin felt different with him there, warmer somehow, as if his presence filled empty spaces she hadn't realized existed. They ate mostly in silence, but it was comfortable now. Coda praised the pie with quiet sincerity, and Sarah found herself sharing that it was her father's favorite recipe. You cook like this often? Before? He asked. Sarah hesitated, then nodded. My mother taught me. She believed food was a way of showing care. The words felt strange in her mouth after so long. She was right. Coda's eyes held hers. Food is medicine, for body and spirit. Something about his gentle certainty loosened a knot inside her. Before she quite realized what was happening, Sarah found herself speaking of her parents. Their journey west when she was 16, full of dreams for a new life in the territory. Her father's steady optimism, her mother's quiet strength. Fever took them, she said, staring into the fire. 2 years after we arrived. First father, then mother a week later. I was 18. Coda listened without interruption, his presence somehow making the telling easier than she'd expected. The Apache have a saying, he offered after she fell silent. Those who have gone before us are not gone. They walk beside us, invisible but present, like wind through grass. Sarah thought about that, about her parents walking beside her all these years. I'd like to believe that. Not about belief, about knowing. He touched his chest. Here. The simple gesture held more comfort than all the platitudes she'd received after her parents' deaths. As the evening deepened, Sarah found herself sharing small stories of her childhood. Her father teaching her to fish, her mother's garden in Pennsylvania. Memories long buried, now rising to the surface like spring plants pushing through winter soil. In return, Coda spoke of his grandmother, a healer respected even by white settlers, who had taught him about plants and their uses. Of his childhood before the wars, when his people still moved freely through their ancestral lands. Neither mentioned what had happened after those times, the losses, the pain. Those stories remained locked away. But it was a beginning, this careful sharing of safer memories. When Coda finally rose to leave, the night had grown dark and star-filled outside her windows. Thank you, he said simply, for the meal, for the stories. Sarah walked him to the door, suddenly reluctant for the evening to end. Will you come again? The question cost her something to ask, an admission of desire for company she'd denied needing for years. Coda seemed to understand the effort it required. He nodded once, solemnly. Yes, if you wish it. I do, Sarah replied, surprising herself with her certainty. After he'd gone, she stood on her porch looking up at the vast sweep of stars. For the first time in years, her solitude felt not like protection, but like emptiness. The rhythms of Sarah's life shifted subtly over the following weeks. Coda visited regularly, sometimes to help with repairs, sometimes simply to share a meal. They spoke of small things, the weather, the garden, his work with Carson's horses. Occasionally, they ventured into deeper waters, sharing fragments of their pasts like precious stones uncovered and briefly examined before being tucked away again. Sarah found herself looking forward to his visits, planning for them, even laughing sometimes. A sound so foreign to her cabin that it seemed to echo with surprise against the walls. The wildflowers bloomed in colorful profusion along the south wall. Coda had been right, they wanted to live, needed only a chance. One pleasant May evening, they sat on her porch watching the sunset paint the distant mountains. Sarah had made coffee, and Coda had brought honey from Carson's hives, a rare treat that sweetened the bitter brew. Carson asked about you, Coda said, his deep voice rumbling in the twilight. Wants to know if you'd sell eggs. His hen's not laying well. Sarah considered this. Selling eggs to Carson meant a connection to the wider community, a small step away from complete isolation. I could spare a dozen each week. Coda nodded. He'll pay fair price. After a pause, he added, he's not like Boyd. Few are, she replied, trying to keep the edge from her voice. Boyd had been conspicuously absent these past weeks, which worried rather than relieved her. Men like him didn't simply give up. As if summoned by her thoughts, hoofbeats sounded on the road, unusual at this hour. Sarah tensed, hand automatically reaching for the shotgun propped against the porch rail. Coda rose silently, positioning himself between her and the approaching rider. His posture was casual, but Sarah had learned to read the subtle signs of his alertness, the slight tilt of his head, the way his weight shifted to the balls of his feet. The rider emerged from the deepening shadows, young Jimmy Patterson, who worked as a message runner for the telegraph office. The boy reined in his horse, eyes widening at the sight of Coda on Sarah's porch. "Miss Winters," he called, keeping a cautious distance. "Mr. Henderson asked me to bring you this." He held out a folded paper. "Said it was important you see it right away." Sarah approached, taking the paper while pressing a penny into the boy's hand. "Thank you, Jimmy. There's strangers in town," the boy blurted, glancing nervously at Coda. "For men. Been asking questions." Sarah's heart stuttered. What kind of questions? About newcomers, especially women living alone. Jimmy shifted uncomfortably. They had a photograph. Sheriff's got them in his office now. With a hasty nod, the boy wheeled his horse and galloped back toward town, clearly eager to be gone before full dark. Sarah unfolded the paper with unsteady fingers. It wasn't a note as she'd expected, but a crudely printed notice. Wanted, Garrett James. For robbery and murder. $500 reward. Below was a rough likeness of a handsome man with cold eyes and a neat mustache. Sarah stared at the familiar features, blood draining from her face. The paper fluttered from her suddenly numb fingers. Coda retrieved it, studying the image before looking at her questioningly. "Sarah?" She couldn't speak, couldn't move. The world had narrowed to a roaring in her ears and the terrible certainty that her past had finally found her. "Sarah." Coda's voice broke through, his hand gentle on her arm. "Inside. Now." She allowed him to guide her into the cabin, where she sank onto a chair, trembling violently. Coda built up the fire, then pressed a cup of water into her hands. "You know this man," he said. Not a question. Sarah nodded, forcing herself to take a sip. "Garrett James." Coda waited patiently while she struggled to find words. "After my parents died," she finally began, her voice barely audible, "I was alone. No family, little money. The banker who handled my father's affairs suggested I take a position as a companion to his sister in Santa Fe." She stared into the fire, seeing not the flames but memories she'd tried for years to bury. There was no sister. The position was in a house of entertainment. For men. Her hands tightened around the cup. "I refused. Tried to leave. That's when Garrett arrived." Coda remained perfectly still, his face unreadable in the firelight. "He was the banker's business partner. Said he'd help me. Said he had a ranch outside of town where I'd be safe." A bitter laugh escaped her. "I believed him. I was young and frightened and alone." "He hurt you," Coda said softly. Sarah touched her shoulder unconsciously, where the scar tissue from the worst of the burns remained. "Yes, but not just me. There were others. Girls who disappeared. I heard their screams sometimes, from the cellar." She closed her eyes, the memories threatening to overwhelm her. "I escaped during a storm. Took his money, his horse. Ran until both gave out. Kept going on foot. Changed my name. I was Sarah Wells before. Kept moving for months until I found this place." 3 years ago, Coda said, understanding dawning in his eyes. Sarah nodded. "I thought he'd forgotten me. Or died." She looked at the wanted poster Coda had placed on the table. Murder. I'm not surprised. The men in town. His associates, probably. They always traveled in groups. Sarah's mind raced with terrible clarity. If they have my photograph, they'll find me. It's just a matter of time. You could leave, Coda suggested. Tonight. I would help you. Sarah looked around her small cabin, at the garden visible through the window, the wildflowers catching the last light, at the life she'd built from nothing. No, she said, her voice steadying. I'm done running from him. Night had fully descended, wrapping Sarah's cabin in darkness held at bay only by the flickering firelight. She sat motionless, the weight of her confession leaving her hollow yet somehow lighter. Coda hadn't spoken since she'd finished her story, his stillness that of a man absorbing a blow. You should go, she finally said. It's not safe to be associated with me now. Instead of answering, Coda rose and moved to the window, scanning the darkness outside. They won't come tonight, he said. Not without more information. You don't know Garrett. Men like him, I know. He turned to face her. Predators. They test before they strike. Sarah reached into the pocket of her dress, withdrawing a small derringer, different from the one she usually carried. This one was silver-plated with a pearl handle, incongruously delicate and feminine. His gun, she explained, placing it on the table between them. I took it when I escaped. It's always loaded. Coda made no move to touch the weapon. You kept it all these years. To remind myself what would happen if he found me. Her fingers trembled slightly as she pushed the gun away. I promised I'd use it on him if he ever came for me again, or on myself if that failed. Sarah, just her name, spoken with such gentleness that something inside her cracked open. I was 16 when my parents decided to move west, she continued, the words coming faster now, a dam breaking. Father sold everything to buy land here. Mother didn't want to come, but she never contradicted him. We had such dreams. She rose, pacing the small confines of the cabin. After they died, the banker, Hollister, seemed so kind, said he'd help settle their debts, find me suitable employment. I trusted him. Her laugh was brittle. Hollister owned half the businesses in Santa Fe, including the brothel. He was looking for fresh faces. When I realized his true intentions and refused, he locked me in a room for 3 days without food. Coda's expression darkened, but he remained silent, letting her speak. That's when Garrett came, so handsome, so concerned. He helped me escape, took me to his ranch outside town. For 2 weeks, he was everything kind and gentle. Sarah's hand drifted unconsciously to her shoulder. Then his true nature emerged. She stopped at the fireplace, staring into the flames. He had other women there, some willing, some not. He'd bring men to the ranch, business associates, he called them. Important men who paid well for entertainment. When I resisted, he used pain to break me. Burns at first. Her voice had gone flat, disconnected. Later, other methods. He was creative. Coda moved then, crossing to stand near her. Not touching, but close enough that she could feel his warmth. There was a girl, Sarah continued, her voice dropping to a whisper. Couldn't have been more than 14. Mary. He brought her one night, locked her in the cellar. Her screams. She closed her eyes. I couldn't save her. But you saved yourself, Coda said quietly. During a thunderstorm, the power went out. The locks failed. Sarah's eyes opened, fever bright. I took his gun, his money, his favorite horse, rode until I couldn't anymore, then walked, kept walking. She turned to face him fully. That's who you've been helping, Coda. A thief, a coward who ran instead of fighting. No, the word was firm, unyielding. A survivor. There's blood on my hands. Mary's blood. The others I left behind. Their blood is on Garrett's hands. not yours. Koda's gaze held hers, steady and certain. You were a prisoner, not a guard. The simple absolution nearly undid her. Sarah turned away, unwilling to let him see her tears. My family was killed by soldiers, Koda said unexpectedly. Apache wars. I was 10. Hidden in rocks by my mother before they came. Sarah went still, listening. Watched everything. Everyone. Mother. Father. Little sister. His voice remained steady, but Sarah heard the cost of that control. Soldiers wore blue uniforms with yellow scarves. 7th Cavalry. He moved to the window again, looking out at the night. When I was 16, I joined Army as scout. Wore blue uniform. Helped them find other Apache. The confession hung in the air between them. Why? Sarah asked softly. To understand enemy. Learn their ways. Their weaknesses. He turned back to her. And because living with hate is like drinking poison, hoping enemy will die. Sarah absorbed his words, understanding the gift he'd given her. Truth for truth, pain for pain. What do we do now? She asked. Now you rest, Koda replied. I'll keep watch tonight. And tomorrow? Tomorrow we prepare. His eyes held a cold determination she'd never seen before. Garrett James will not take you again. This I promise. Sarah looked at the man standing in her cabin. A man she'd allowed past her defenses, past the boundary of her no men allowed sign. A man who'd heard her worst confessions and still looked at her with respect rather than pity or disgust. I believe you, she said simply. Later, as she lay in her bed with Koda keeping vigil by the window, Sarah realized something extraordinary. For the first time in 3 years, despite the danger lurking beyond her walls, she felt truly safe. Dawn arrived with gentle indifference to the danger it illuminated. Sarah woke to find Koda still at his post by the window, vigilant despite the night's passing. On the table lay his cavalry knife, long, wickedly sharp, with a worn leather grip that spoke of years of use. You need sleep, she said, moving to stoke the fire. Later, Koda's eyes remained fixed on the landscape beyond her property. Carson will wonder where I am. Need to tell him something. Sarah measured coffee grounds with careful precision, her movements deliberately normal despite the fear coiling inside her. Tell him the truth. He should know there might be trouble. Boyd has his ear. Regularly. The implication was clear. Boyd would use any information about Sarah's past to his advantage. Then tell him what you must. But don't put yourself at risk for me. Koda finally looked at her, his expression softening slightly. Already decided that risk. The simple statement hung between them, heavy with meaning neither was ready to examine. After a sparse breakfast, they took inventory of Sarah's defenses. The cabin itself was sturdy, built of thick logs with only 2 windows and a solid door. Her shotgun and rifle were cleaned and loaded, ammunition boxes stacked nearby. The Derringer, both hers and Garrett's, were checked and placed in accessible locations. Garrett won't come alone, Sarah said as they surveyed her property from the porch. He'll bring at least 3 men, maybe more. How will he approach? Directly, with a smile. She crossed her arms against a sudden chill. He'll try charm first, violence second. Koda nodded, unsurprised. His men will circle while he talks. Standard tactics. You've seen this before. Many times. He pointed to the open area between her cabin and the road. Too exposed. Need cover. For the next few hours, they worked methodically to strengthen her homestead's defenses. Koda helped her move her heavier furniture to create barricades near windows. Together they dug shallow trenches at strategic points around the property. Escape routes if needed, covered by brush that looked natural but could be quickly cleared. Midday, Koda prepared to leave for the Carson ranch. Will return by sunset. Bring supplies. Sarah walked him to where his horse was tethered. Be careful in town. Garrett's men will be watching for anyone connected to me. They won't recognize that connection yet. He mounted in one fluid motion. Keep shotgun close. Use alarm system if anyone approaches. She nodded, suddenly reluctant to see him go. Coda. He waited, his dark eyes patient. Thank you, she said finally, for believing me, for staying. His only response was a slight inclination of his head before he rode away, but it was enough. Alone, Sarah moved through her cabin with renewed purpose. She gathered her most precious possessions, her father's pocket watch, her mother's recipe book, the wooden horse Coda had carved, and wrapped them carefully in oilcloth, securing the bundle beneath a loose floorboard. Whatever happened, she wouldn't let Garrett destroy these fragments of her true self. Next, she retrieved a small metal box from beneath her bed. Inside lay the legal papers proving her ownership of the homestead, under the name Sarah Winters, along with the small amount of money she'd saved. These she divided and hid in separate locations. Garrett would search for valuables first if he gained entry. By late afternoon, Sarah had transformed her garden into a secondary food cache, burying preserves and dried goods in waterproof containers among her plantings. She'd survived on the run before. She could do it again if necessary. The sound of approaching riders sent her scrambling for the shotgun. But it was only Carson himself, accompanied by Coda and another ranch hand. They carried supplies, ammunition, food, medical items. Miss Winters, Carson greeted her gruffly. Coda tells me you might have trouble coming. Sarah glanced at Coda, who gave a nearly imperceptible nod. Men from my past, she confirmed. They mean me harm. Carson, a weathered man in his 60s, studied her thoughtfully. Coda didn't share details. Don't need him. But Boyd's been in town all day, talking with some strangers. Thought you should know. Cold dread settled in Sarah's stomach. Thank you for the warning. These supplies are yours, Carson continued, and Coda has my permission to stay as long as needed. We take care of our neighbors in this valley. He glanced between Sarah and Coda with shrewd eyes. Some of us, anyway. After they unloaded the supplies, Carson and his hand departed, leaving Coda behind. Sarah watched them go with mixed emotions. Gratitude for their help, fear for having drawn them into her troubles. What did you tell him? She asked Coda as they carried supplies inside. That men from your past threatened you. That you needed help. He met her eyes directly. No more, no less. Evening approached, painting the distant mountains gold and crimson as they completed their preparations. Sarah found Coda standing by her wildflower bed, examining the vibrant blooms. If I die, he said without preamble, return to Carson Ranch. My possessions in footlocker under bunk. Take what you want. Burn the rest. The matter-of-fact statement chilled her. You won't die. All men die. He turned to her, eyes serious. But we choose how. Sarah stepped closer, compelled by an urgency she didn't fully understand. I won't have your death on my conscience too. My choice, he replied simply. My life to risk. As darkness fell, they took their positions inside the cabin, Coda by the north window with a clear view of the approach road, Sarah by the south, watching the back of the property. Between them lay their weapons, ready for whatever might come. Get some sleep, Coda said softly. I'll wake you in 4 hours to trade watch. Sarah knew she should rest while she could, but her mind raced with possibilities, each more terrible than the last. Coda, she said into the growing darkness. If Garrett takes me, don't follow. Promise me that. His silence was her only answer. The riders came at mid-morning, when the sun had climbed high enough to illuminate every corner of Sarah's property. No sneaking approach under cover of darkness. Garrett James had always preferred to operate in plain sight, hiding his true nature behind the facade of respectability. Sarah spotted them first, for figures on horseback approaching slowly along the main road. Her breath caught as she recognized the lead rider, tall and straight-backed, his black coat immaculate despite the trail dust, a silver watch chain gleaming against his brocade vest. "He's here," she said, her voice remarkably steady despite the terror clawing at her throat. Coda moved silently to her side, peering through the window. His expression hardened as he assessed the approaching men. For total, all armed. Sarah had spent the night teetering between panic and a strange, fatalistic calm. Now, with danger materializing on her doorstep, the calm prevailed. She checked her shotgun methodically, then touched the derringer in her pocket. Garrett's own weapon, waiting to return to its former owner in the most fitting way possible. "Remember the plan," Coda murmured. "Let him talk. Learn his intentions." Sarah nodded. "Stay out of sight until I signal." Coda retreated to the back room as Sarah positioned herself near the front window, shotgun visible but not aimed. She watched Garrett rein in his horse at her gate, his familiar smile appearing as he surveyed her homestead. The three men with him spread out slightly, hired guns with hard eyes and well-worn holsters. One of them she recognized with a jolt, Miller, Garrett's right hand, a man whose cruelty had rivaled his employer's. He looked older now, a jagged scar running from his temple to his jaw that hadn't been there 3 years ago. Sarah allowed herself a moment of satisfaction at the sight. She'd given him that scar during her escape, smashing an oil lamp against his face as she fled. Garrett dismounted with elegant precision, adjusting his coat before opening her gate. The "no men allowed" sign seemed to amuse him as he brushed past it. He approached her cabin alone, leaving his men with the horses. Sarah waited until he reached the porch before opening the door, shotgun held casually across her body. "Hello, Sarah," Garrett said, his voice as smooth and cultured as she remembered. "It's been a long time." "Not long enough." She kept the door half closed, her body blocking the entrance. "What do you want?" He chuckled, removing his hat with a theatrical flourish. "Is that any way to greet an old friend? After all we've been through together. State your business or leave my property." Garrett's smile remained fixed, but his eyes hardened slightly. "You've developed quite a sharp tongue. That will need correction." He glanced around at her homestead. "Lovely little place you've carved out for yourself. With my money, as I recall." "Compensation," Sarah replied, "for services rendered." His smile tightened at her deliberately provocative choice of words. "I've come to bring you home, Sarah. This little adventure of yours has gone on long enough. This is my home." "A hovel in the wilderness?" Garrett shook his head with exaggerated disappointment. "You were meant for better things, finer things, which I provided quite generously, if you'll remember." Sarah's grip tightened on the shotgun. "I remember everything. Then you'll remember that what's mine remains mine." His voice dropped, the cultured veneer slipping to reveal the steel beneath. "You are mine, Sarah. You've always been mine. The sooner you accept that, the easier this will be for everyone." "I'm no one's property." Garrett sighed, as if dealing with a petulant child. "I had hoped you'd be reasonable. For old time's sake." He reached into his coat, producing a folded document. "But I came prepared for your stubbornness." He held out the paper. "A marriage certificate, properly filed in Santa Fe 3 years ago. You are legally Mrs. Garrett James." Sarah stared at the document, bile rising in her throat. "Forged. Entirely authentic, I assure you. Ask anyone in town. I've already presented it to your charming local sheriff." Garrett's smile turned triumphant. "He was quite concerned to learn I've been searching for my unstable wife, who fled after a nervous breakdown. Poor, delicate Sarah, whose mind shattered after the tragic loss of her parents. The calculated cruelty of his fiction, twisting her genuine grief into a weapon against her, momentarily stole Sarah's breath. The sheriff expressed his sincere apologies for any inconvenience you might have caused," Garrett continued smoothly. He's granted me full authority to return you to proper medical care. By force, if necessary. Sarah forced herself to remain outwardly calm, though her heart hammered against her ribs. Sheriff Taylor is a fool if he believes you. Perhaps. But he's a fool with a badge and the law behind him. Garrett tucked the false certificate away. Now you have a choice. Come willingly, and I'll allow you to gather your personal belongings. Resist, and my men will burn this place to the ground while the sheriff looks the other way. He stepped closer, lowering his voice to the intimate tone she remembered from her darkest nightmares. Did you really think you could escape me forever, Sarah? That I wouldn't find you? That I'd simply forget what you stole from me? I stole nothing that wasn't rightfully mine, she replied steadily. My freedom, my body, my life. Garrett's facade cracked slightly, a flash of rage crossing his handsome features before he controlled it. Always so dramatic. He glanced over his shoulder at his waiting men. I'll give you 1 hour to pack your things and say goodbye to this experiment in independence. Then we leave one way or another. He turned to go, then paused. Oh, and Sarah? If you're thinking your Indian friend will save you, don't. Boyd has been most informative about your arrangement with the savage. Unfortunately, there was an incident at the Carson Ranch this morning. I doubt he'll be joining us. Cold fear washed through her. What have you done? Garrett smiled, placing his hat back on his head with deliberate slowness. 1 hour, Sarah. Don't waste it on misplaced loyalty to a dead man. Sarah bolted the door the moment Garrett turned his back, her calm facade crumbling as she pressed her forehead against the rough wood. A marriage certificate. She should have anticipated this. Garrett's preferred method had always been to use the law as a weapon, twisting it to serve his purposes. Coda, she called softly, turning toward the back room. No answer. With mounting dread, Sarah moved through the cabin, shotgun raised. The back room was empty, the window slightly ajar. Coda was gone. Had he heard Garrett's claim about trouble at the Carson Ranch? Had he slipped away to investigate? Or had he simply abandoned her, recognizing a fight that couldn't be won? Sarah pushed the thought away. Regardless of Coda's whereabouts, she now faced Garrett alone, just as she'd always expected to, just as she'd prepared for. Moving quickly, she gathered her hidden caches of money and documents. The deed to her property, her true deed, legally filed under the name Sarah Winters, she tucked into her boot. If she had to run again, proof of her identity would be essential. From beneath the loose floorboard, she retrieved the bundle containing her parents' keepsakes and added her journal. Even if Garrett burned everything else, these fragments of her true self would survive. A quick glance out the window showed Garrett's men making themselves comfortable. Miller had started a small fire near the gate, a deliberately provocative act. Another man led their horses to her water trough while the third checked the perimeter of her property with the methodical precision of a professional manhunter. Garrett himself stood in the center of her yard, examining her wildflower garden with detached curiosity. The sight of him so casually invading her sanctuary sent a surge of rage through Sarah so powerful it momentarily eclipsed her fear. She forced herself to think clearly. Options: fight, flee, or surrender. Surrender meant returning to a life worse than death. Unacceptable. Flight was possible. She knew the surrounding terrain better than Garrett's men, could potentially lose them in the hills. But she'd be leaving with only what she could carry, abandoning everything she'd built. And Garrett would simply wait at the cabin, knowing she'd need supplies eventually. Fight, then, against 4 armed men with Coda missing and no help coming. Sarah rechecked her weapons and gathered additional ammunition. She filled canteens with water and packed a small sack with preserves and dried meat. Then she sat at her table and unfolded her property deed, studying the official seal that declared this land hers. Not Garrett's, not any man's. When the sound of breaking glass shattered the silence, she was almost relieved. The waiting had been excruciating. "That's your first window, Sarah," Garrett called from outside. Time's running short. 40 minutes left. Sarah moved silently to the intact window, peering out to see Miller grinning beside a rock he'd obviously thrown, deliberately provoking her to waste ammunition, a standard tactic. A flicker of movement beyond the men caught her attention. Something in the distant tree line. A flash of color that didn't belong. Sarah forced herself not to react, not to look directly at it. Could it be Coda? Hope warred with pragmatism. Even if it was him, one man against 4 seasoned killers changed little. Miller's next rock took out her second window, sending glass shards skittering across the floor. 30 minutes, Sarah, came Garrett's mocking voice. I've instructed the men to start with your chicken coop next. Shame to waste good livestock. Sarah bit her lip hard enough to taste blood. Garrett knew exactly how to push her, targeting the innocent creatures in her care, the small life she'd built, forcing her to choose between abandoning them to cruelty or surrendering herself, just as he'd done with Mary and the others all those years ago. A gunshot cracked the air, followed by panicked squawking from her chickens. Sarah closed her eyes briefly, steeling herself against the manipulation. Such a waste, Garrett called. All this destruction could be avoided with a simple decision. He was right about one thing she needed to decide. Continue the siege, watching her home and animals systematically destroyed until she had nothing left, or take action on her own terms. Sarah ran her fingers over the deed one last time before tucking it securely into her bodice. Then she checked Garrett's silver derringer, ensuring it was loaded and ready. I'm coming out, she called, her voice stronger than she felt. Hold your fire. Wise choice, Garrett replied, satisfaction evident in his tone. Sarah gathered her small bundle of keepsakes and slung it across her body. The shotgun she reluctantly left behind. They'd never let her approach with it. But the derringer remained hidden in her pocket, a final recourse if all else failed. She opened the door slowly, hands visible, and stepped onto the porch. Garrett stood waiting in her yard, looking for all the world like a gentleman caller rather than a predator. Miller and one other man flanked him, while the third had positioned himself behind her cabin, cutting off any escape route. There she is, Garrett said warmly, as if greeting her at a social gathering. My wayward bride. Sarah descended the porch steps on shaky legs. Each step away from the safety of her cabin felt like moving through molasses, her body instinctively resisting even as her mind drove her forward. I have conditions, she said, stopping several yards from Garrett. He raised an eyebrow, amused. You're hardly in a position to negotiate. Nonetheless, Sarah drew herself up to her full height. You will leave my property intact. No more destruction. And my animals are to be given to the Carson Ranch. Garrett chuckled. Sentimental about a few chickens? Very well, if it eases your transition. Sarah took another step forward, her hand slipping into her pocket to grasp the derringer. One shot. She'd need to make it count. I have one more condition, she said, moving closer. And what might that be? Garrett asked, his smile never reaching his eyes. You'll go to hell knowing I sent you there. Time slowed as Sarah's fingers closed around the derringer in her pocket. 10 feet separated her from Garrett, close enough for the small gun's limited accuracy, far enough that his men couldn't reach her before she fired. One shot. One chance to end the nightmare forever. Garrett's smile faltered as he read the intent in her eyes. His hand moved toward his own weapon. Now, Sarah, he said, his voice losing its cultured edge. Don't do anything foolish. The crack of a rifle shot froze them all. Not from Sarah's cabin, but from the distant tree line. Miller cried out, clutching his shoulder as blood blossomed across his shirt. Chaos erupted. Garrett's men scrambled for cover, drawing weapons, firing blindly toward the trees. Garrett himself lunged forward, closing the distance to Sarah before she could react. His hand clamped around her wrist, twisting painfully until the derringer fell from her grasp. Inside, he snarled, dragging her toward the cabin as bullets kicked up dust around them. Sarah fought against his grip, but Garrett had always been deceptively strong. He shoved her through the doorway, following close behind, using her body as a shield. "Your savage friend," he spat, securing the door behind them. "Should have known he'd bring reinforcements." Hope surged through Sarah. Coda was alive, and apparently not alone. Garrett pushed her roughly into a chair, keeping low beneath the windows as gunfire continued outside. "This changes nothing," he said, checking his revolver. "Just means we'll be traveling at night instead of now." Sarah glared up at him, refusing to cower despite the cold fury in his eyes. "You'll never make it off my land alive." Brave words from a woman who trembled at my touch for months. He backhanded her across the face, splitting her lip. "That spirit will need to be broken again, it seems." Sarah tasted blood but felt no fear, only a strange, fierce clarity. She was not the same frightened girl he had controlled through terror. Whatever happened now, she would never again be his victim. Outside, the gunfire had become sporadic. One of Garrett's men called out, something about riders approaching from the south. "Damn it," Garrett muttered, peering cautiously out the window. His expression darkened. "Your Apache brought half the territory with him." Sarah followed his gaze. Through the broken window, she could see dust rising on the road from Carson's direction. Multiple riders moving fast. Garrett retreated from the window, calculating. "New plan. We leave now, using the back way." He seized Sarah's arm, yanking her to her feet. "You'll walk beside me. Anyone shoots, they risk hitting you." "They'll still kill you," Sarah said with certainty. "Perhaps." His grip tightened painfully. "But you'll die first." He forced her toward the back door, keeping his revolver pressed against her ribs. As they stepped onto the back porch, Sarah saw the third gunman lying motionless near her garden, an arrow protruding from his chest. Not just Coda then. His Apache friends had joined the fight. Garrett cursed under his breath, scanning the surrounding area. "Move," he ordered, shoving her forward. They had barely cleared the porch when a figure rose from behind the woodpile. Coda. His face streaked with what looked like war paint, a cavalry knife gleaming in his hand. Garrett's reaction was instantaneous. He swung his revolver toward Coda, simultaneously using Sarah as a shield. "Back," he commanded, "or she dies right now." Coda remained motionless, his dark eyes moving from Garrett to Sarah. In that brief exchange of glances, understanding passed between them. Sarah let her body go suddenly limp, dropping her weight against Garrett's arm. The unexpected movement threw him off balance just as Coda lunged forward. Garrett fired wildly, the bullet grazing Sarah's arm as she twisted away from him. Pain blazed through her, but she continued her desperate scramble towards safety. What followed happened so quickly Sarah could barely process it. Coda and Garrett locked in combat, the knife against the now empty revolver, two men fighting with the focused intensity of predators. Garrett was heavier, but Coda moved with the fluid grace of a lifetime warrior. They crashed against the woodpile, sending logs tumbling. Dust rose around them as they grappled for dominance. A shout from the front of the cabin, Miller's voice, warning Garrett of approaching riders. The momentary distraction cost him dearly as Coda's knife found its mark, slicing across Garrett's forearm. Garrett howled in pain and rage, managing to knock the knife from Coda's hand. They separated, circling each other warily. "She's mine," Garrett snarled, blood streaming down his arm. "She'll always be mine." "She belongs to no one," Coda replied, his voice deadly calm. "Least of all you." Sarah scrambled for the fallen knife, her fingers closing around its hilt just as Garrett charged Coda again. They went down hard, Garrett's superior weight giving him advantage as his hands closed around Coda's throat. Without hesitation, Sarah rushed forward and plunged the knife into Garrett's side. He made a strangled sound of disbelief, releasing Coda to clutch at the wound. His eyes, wide with shock, found Sarah's face. "You?" he gasped, blood bubbling at his lips. "I am not yours," Sarah said, her voice steady despite the trembling in her limbs. "I never was." Garrett lunged for her with his remaining strength, hands outstretched like claws. Coda intercepted him, delivering a powerful blow that sent Garrett crashing to the ground. This time he didn't rise. The sudden silence was broken only by their ragged breathing and the approaching thunder of hoofbeats from the front of the property. Sarah stared at Garrett's motionless form, waiting for the relief, the liberation his death should bring. Instead, she felt hollow, drained, as if something fundamental had been cut away, leaving a raw, empty space that had yet to heal. Coda's hand touched her shoulder gently. "Sarah." She turned to him, seeing the bruises forming on his throat, the concern in his eyes. Without words, she stepped into his embrace, burying her face against his chest as the tears finally came. Not for Garrett, but for all that had been taken from her, for all she had survived. Dawn broke over Sarah's homestead, illuminating the aftermath of violence with gentle indifference. Sheriff Taylor and his deputies had arrived with Carson and his men just as the fighting ended. They found Miller wounded but alive, the third gunman dead, and Garrett James, wanted outlaw, according to the poster that had so recently arrived in town, bleeding his last on Sarah's land. The sheriff's attitude had shifted remarkably once he'd seen the territorial wanted poster and compared it to the man dying on the ground. Suddenly, Sarah was no longer an unstable wife, but a citizen who had defended her legal property against known criminals. "You'll need to come to town tomorrow to make a statement," Taylor had told her, unable to meet her eyes directly. "Formalities, that's all." She'd nodded, too exhausted to speak. Carson had taken charge then, sending men to remove the bodies and secure Miller for transport to the town jail. Through it all, Coda had remained at her side, silent support as the chaos slowly resolved into order. Now, as the new day began, Sarah sat on her porch steps, watching the rising sun paint her wildflowers in gold. The physical evidence of yesterday's violence had been cleared away, but the memories remained, raw and vivid. Her wounded arm throbbed beneath its bandage, a minor injury compared to what might have been. The door opened behind her, and Coda emerged with 2 steaming cups of coffee. He handed one to Sarah before settling beside her on the step, his shoulder just touching hers. They sat in companionable silence, watching the morning unfold. A rabbit ventured cautiously from the tall grass, nose twitching as it tested the air. In the distance, a red-tailed hawk circled lazily on rising thermals. "What will you do now?" Coda finally asked, his deep voice gentle in the morning quiet. Sarah considered the question, turning the warm cup between her palms. "Rebuild what was damaged. Plant more wildflowers." She glanced at him. "Continue living." He nodded, understanding the profound simplicity of her answer. After so many years defined by fear and flight, the freedom to simply live was no small thing. "And you?" she asked. "Carson will need you back at the ranch." Coda looked out over her land, his expression thoughtful. "Carson offered me a choice. Stay on as foreman or—" He hesitated. "Or, he has a second property, smaller, near the foothills." Coda's eyes remained fixed on the distant mountains. "Offered to sell it to me. Fair price." Sarah's heart quickened unexpectedly. "You'd stay in the valley then?" "Land speaks to me here," he said, echoing words he'd shared weeks ago. "Feels right." They lapsed into silence again, each contemplating possibilities neither had dared consider before yesterday. The future stretched before them, no longer shadowed by Sarah's past or confined by rigid boundaries. "I need to remove that sign," Sarah said suddenly. Coda followed her gaze to the weathered "No Men Allowed" sign still hanging on her gate. "Has served its purpose," he agreed. Together they walked to the gate. Sarah ran her fingers over the rough wood, remembering the frightened, angry woman who had carved those letters 3 years ago. A woman who believed isolation was her only safety, who trusted nothing and no one. She unhooked the sign, holding it contemplatively. I should burn it. Could, Coda agreed, or could make something new from it. That afternoon, as the valley settled into the peaceful rhythms of an ordinary day, Sarah worked at her table, carefully sanding down her old sign. Beside her, Coda carved intricate patterns into the border, his hands strong and sure. When Sheriff Taylor arrived to take her statement, he found them working side by side. The cabin door opened to the spring air, no weapons in sight. He'd shifted uncomfortably, apologizing awkwardly for his role in Garrett's deception. Man showed papers that looked official, he'd explained lamely. Boyd vouched for him too. Boyd would, Sarah had replied simply, neither accusing nor absolving. After the sheriff departed, promising that Miller would face territorial justice, Sarah and Coda returned to their project. By sunset, the transformation was complete. The old sign had been reborn, the harsh warning replaced with a single word burned into the wood in Coda's careful hand. Welcome. They hung it together as the first stars appeared in the deepening blue sky. Tomorrow I go to town, Sarah said, standing back to admire their work, to make my statement, and to visit the land office. Coda looked at her questioningly. Need to make sure my deed is properly recorded, she explained. Under my real name, Sarah Wells. His eyes held hers in the gathering dusk. Good name. It was my father's, she said softly. Time I reclaimed it. Later, as they shared a simple dinner at her table, their conversation turned to practical matters. Repairs needed, supplies to purchase, seeds to plant. The ordinary concerns of people building a life rather than simply surviving one. When Coda rose to leave for the Carson Ranch, Sarah walked him to the gate. The night was clear and star-filled, a gentle breeze carrying the scent of her wildflowers. Will you come tomorrow? She asked. After I return from town? Coda nodded, his hand briefly covering hers where it rested on the gatepost. Every day, he said simply. If you wish it. Sarah smiled, a genuine expression that reached her eyes in a way smiles hadn't for years. I do wish it. He mounted his horse, looking down at her one last time before departing. No words were needed, they had time now. Time to heal, to learn each other, to discover what might grow between them. Sarah watched him ride away, then turned back to her cabin. The light in her window beckoned welcomingly. No longer a fortress against the world, but a home opening to new possibilities. She touched the eagle feather she now wore woven into a small braid at her temple, Coda's gift of protection that had somehow become a promise of something more. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, but for tonight, Sarah Wells was simply at peace on the land she had claimed as her own, surrounded by wildflowers that had asked only for a chance to live.